Hello everyone, my name is Thibault Duretz. I am CNRS researcher in Geosciences Rennes. The title of my talk is Strain Localization in Lithosphere Dynamics Models, and the aim of this presentation is to briefly show you the different approaches which are used to model strain localization in lithosphere dynamics models. The ultimate aim of our research is to understand plate boundary formation. To that end, geodynamic modelers have made quite some progress in the recent years. This is an example of a global convection model showing the role of the yield stress on the formation of tectonic plates. Yield stress increases from left to right. For a yield stress of 100 megapascal, you have the generation of many plates, which is accompanied by the generation of numerous discontinuous slabs. For high stresses of 200 megapascal here, you have the generation of only a few tectonic plates and very well defined continuous slabs. What was shown by this study is that in order to get Earth-like tectonic patterns, the yield stress should be within 150 megapascal to 200 megapascal. If we now construct a rheological profile out of this model, this is what we obtain. Here you see the depth in kilometers. The blue line here is curved. It's basically the temperature-dependent strength due to viscous flow. And here is constant yield stress of 150 megapascal. If we integrate the shear stress with depth, we obtain a force of about 10 to the 13 Newton per meter. This value is in agreement with the first order estimation of plate driving forces, such as the slab pull. Now we are interested in the details of lithospheric deformation, and we know that we need to incorporate more deformation mechanism. Such a rheological profile is overly simplified. So if we include lab-derived data, we know that we need to consider pressure-dependent plasticity, low-temperature plasticity, power law creep, elasticity. This implies that we have rather weak horizons in the lower part of the upper crust, the lower part of the lower crust, or the lower part of the mantle lithosphere. In order to maintain a force of about 10 to the 13 Newton per meter, this also implies that we have strong levels, such as the brittle ductile transition of the upper crust, the lower crust, and the top part of the mantle lithosphere. You see that the shear stress here can increase up to 600 megapascal in the mantle lithosphere. So we have load-bearing levels in the lithosphere, and these are essential for plate tectonics and strain localization. This has been previously addressed by Burov, here an example from 2014, where he has shown that stable plate tectonics require the occurrence of a load-bearing level in the mantle lithosphere. So you can see top left stable subduction occurring with a jelly sandwich model, while unstable subduction occurs when there is no load-bearing level in the mantle lithosphere. Another important point here is that stress states are transient, and that strain localization is often accompanied by a stress drop. So this is a sketch taken from Bourg after Toulis and Toulis that shows typical stress strain curves from lab data. So you see basically the elastic deformation, which is characterized by an increase of stress, and after some point there are two branches, one strain hardening and one strain softening. So you see that stresses varies with actual strain or time. And the reason for this, for example, strain softening can be manifold. So that we have structural softening, which is basically internal reorganization of the material due, for example, to necking of layers or formation of shear bands. We have material softening, which may be linked to mineral reactions or grain size evolution. And we have also thermal softening, which is related to dissipation and shearing. This is not disconnected from field observation. These are two recent papers from 2014 that infer important transient stress variations from field observations. This is also documented from numerical models of shear localization, which also show stress loading and unloading during shear band formation. Now I want to give you the basic ingredients of lithosphere dynamics model. So these are the equations on which most codes are based. At the top you have two equations for momentum balance, because here we consider a 2D problem. These equations can be solved for obtaining the components of the velocity vector. In the middle, you have here the continuity equation, which assumes a divergence-free flow, which can be solved for obtaining the pressure. And at the bottom, we have an energy conservation equation, here under the form of a temperature evolution equation, which can be solved for obtaining the evolution of temperature. These codes need to account for a complex viscoelastoplastic rheology, which needs to be based on lab-derived flow laws. So you can, for example, account for deformation maps that combines dislocation, diffusion, Pyre's creep, and of course plasticity. A second important ingredient is the resolution power of the model. The best we get so far in 2 dimensions is 100 meter scale. Another important point is that 2D at least is necessary to study the propagation of shear zones. The 1D model cannot propagate into surrounding medium. So if you want to study propagation dynamics of shear bands, we need at least 2D, or at best we would need now 3-dimensional modeling. Then these models are based on continuum mechanics, so this has a consequence that even the modeled faults are ductile shear zones. Next, I want to show you how strain localization is typically taken into account in lithosphere dynamics model. The first approach is to prescribe strain localization, for example, by prescribing the geometry. This is typically done in models of subduction dynamics in order to ensure that subduction initiation takes place at a given location. So this is useful as it can produce a subduction zone, and you can then study the penetration of the slab deep in the mantle. Another way is to prescribe the rheology. So this is, for example, ad hoc strain softening. Here we can decide how much the friction angle, for example, will decrease with a given quantity of accumulated strain. This, of course, results in the formation of very sharp plastic shear bands and can be used to study the evolution of rifts. Although these approaches may be useful to study tectonic processes, they are not useful to study the processes of strain localization because they overrule the physics of strain localization. Both approaches force strain localization to take place, so they have no predictive power on the occurrence of shear bands because they have to form. Additionally, parameters that are used in this kind of simulations are often far from experimental constraints. And last but not least, a lot of numerical problems were reported with these approaches. Since usually no length scale is controlling the strain localization, this results in mesh dependence or in weak zone sustainability throughout subduction evolution. When we are interested in the process of strain localization, we need to actually model strain localization. This is the example of structural softening, which is in this particular case related to the necking of internal layers. So if we want to model this, we need to numerically resolve these internal layers initially, and also to resolve the mechanical instability which are related to the deformation of these layers. This is the necking here. This approach does not require any modification of the governing equations. So consider this layer material which will undergo layer parallel extension. At the top right corner, you have a model in which the layers have a power law rheology while the matrix has a linear viscous rheology. In this case, no shear band develop. In the lower panel, both the layers and the matrix have a parallel viscous rheology. You see here the development of prominent low-angle shear bands. So the mechanism of structural softening can predict or not the occurrence of strain localization. We have further applied this model to study lithospheric rifting. So these are figures on the right side now. At the top right, you see a model in which you have a crust in red and mantle in green colors. The first model has no internal layers, and when stretching takes place, only a single neck develops. In the lower panel, you see a model that includes numerous strong layers in the crust and mantle. These layers are flat initially. When stretching takes place, you see that the deformation is strongly asymmetric and that lots of features such as tilted blocks or continental allochtones suddenly appear. The next strain localization process I want to discuss is thermal softening, shearing or viscous dissipation basically. So this relies on the thermomechanical coupling and the thermal dependence of viscosity. So it's the simplest physics and experiments-based shear localization process. So you see on the left side, you have the governing equations. There is an important term which should not be missed here in the temperature evolution equation. Is the product of deviatoric stress tensor with strain rate tensor. It's basically the dissipation. On the right side, you have experimental data which shows the strong dependence of creep viscosity on temperature. Numerical models can consistently combine these two aspects. One interesting thing here is that shearing has an internal length scale of localization, but it cannot provide a long-term memory. It's a self-healing mechanism because local temperature production due to shear also diffuses away from the shear band. Here is an example of subduction initiation by shearing. On the left side you have an oceanic plate, on the right side you have a continental plate, and this system is subjected to pure shear compression. The color represents the magnitude of the stress. You see here a layer with about 500 megapascal stress in the oceanic lithosphere. As the model is being compressed, stress builds up and here reaches a value of about 800 megapascal. You can also observe that the continental plate is starting to buckle. However, subduction initiation by shearing takes over and you see that the subduction is now propagating across the different lithospheric levels, and most importantly you can see that the stress is being relaxed everywhere. So we have the initiation of the subduction zone and the relaxation of stresses in plates surrounding. You can also see that the stress in the subduction interface is not really large. The next strain localization mechanism I want to discuss is the combination of both material softening and thermal softening. So here we consider grain size evolution and shearing. To take this into account, you need to modify the governing equations. You see in the yellow boxes are terms that are related to grain size evolution. One important point is that we actually need to solve an additional equation for the grain size evolution. Here it's an ODE, it is the lowermost equation, so R represents the grain size that will evolve in time. The competition between grain reduction and grain growth controls the grain size. So weakening can be fast, but healing may be slow if we consider a grain size spinning model. So this will give a memory to the model. Since grain size evolution is governed by an ODE rather than a PDE, what controls the internal length scale of localization is so far not clear. Also, there is no consensus on what is the form of this equation that governs grain size evolution. Luckily, we have a lot of the members of the community that are working on that topic right now. Therefore, there are a lot of ongoing developments on that topic, and single-phase models, two-phase models, or phase mixing models were recently developed. I will not talk about this into detail, but there will be a talk of Elvira Bulyukova in the next days, so I hope she can explain all of this to you. Here is an example of a model that combines material softening and thermal softening. So the top box is the average stress in the model. The middle box is the creep strain rate, and the lower box is the grain size field. So this is the initial condition. We here use a dry olivine. We combine elasticity, diffusion creep, dislocation creep. Is the single phase model grain size evolution with a pin grain growth. The model is subjected to simple shear, and a heterogeneity is included at the left side of the model in order to seed strain localization. Initially, you see a phase of stress buildup and the initiation of a shear band at the tip of the inclusion located on the left side. In the bottom panel, the area colored in red indicates location where stresses are high. They exceed 650 megapascal in this case. With ongoing deformation and ongoing time, we finally reach a maximum stress here of 600 megapascal. This is the average stress. And you see that the shear band is now propagating away from the inclusion. With ongoing strain, the shear zone continues to propagate and looks more and more like a laser sword. The average stress starts dropping. This is the onset of softening. With ongoing deformation, you see that the shear band continues propagating. We start observing grain size reduction outside the shear band. Now, at the end of the simulation, the stress has dropped half the maximum stress. The shear band has reached a full propagation. So, just to wrap up these different lithospheric strain localization approaches, so I described prescribed localization mechanism, which can be done by either prescribing geometry with weak zones or prescribing the rheology with ad hoc softening. On the right side, we have the models in which localization is actually modeled. This can be done by either considering structural softening related to necking, thermal softening related to shear-eating, for example, or material softening related to grain size. Models that prescribe localization have no predictive power because they impose strain localization. They're not suitable to study strain localization processes in itself, but they can be useful to study tectonic processes on their own. The models on the right are predictive for strain localization. Localization may or may not occur with these models. They are suitable to study strain localization. However, these mechanisms are usually considered independently, and it will be important in the future to consider them together within the same models to see how they interact. Here are some points for discussion later, and I think this meeting is exactly the right place to discuss these points. So the first point is what controls the length scale of strain localization. For example, we do have underhand models that do not have any internal length scale of localization. We have models that do have one, like shear-eating, and models for which the length scale of shear localization is still not really clear, like grain size evolution, for example. Next point is, can models capture spatial and temporal evolution of shear zones? Shear zones may be thinner than resolution power of a model, and stress drops may be faster than temporal resolution of a model. So this is a big problem, and somehow we need to upscale things. This is a point for discussion. How can models be compared to field observation? What scales can be used for comparisons? What are patterns in 2 or 3D? For example, what are the distribution of grain sizes into shear bands? What are the dimensions of shear bands themselves? These are points to discuss. Another point about strain localization mechanisms is, are they competitive or collaborative? As I was stating before, most mechanisms are studied independently, and it's now time to start studying them together to see if they are in competition or if they collaborate together. This is an example of a lithospheric model made by Lorenzo Condioti, which shows the evolution of a lithosphere, first in extension, then in compression. So it's like a Wilson cycle model. The colors in the crust indicate the composition. The yellow stands for the upper crust and the green stands for the lower crust. The rest of the domain is covered with the magnitude of the effective viscosity. So the dark colors indicate high viscosity and the white colors indicate the low viscosity. Initially, we have placed a lot of elliptical inclusions in the lithosphere, and this will be responsible for structural softening during the rifting stage. So as rifting takes place, you see asymmetric rift opens and lots of these hyperextension features develop due to structural softening. As extension continues, we open an oceanic basin here. You start seeing lithospheric drips. So we have convection taking over here, and during thermal relaxation, you see that the ridge typically disappears. Then subduction is going to take place because the system is going under compression right now, and you see that the passive margin is being inverted, and what's happening here is subduction initiation driven by shear-eating at this place. Then we get subduction of the entire oceanic basin. It is not only driven by shear-eating, but it is also aided by the subduction of sediments within the plate interface. Now we have the onset of continental subduction and continental collision with ongoing compression, and because continental crust resists subduction, we finally get the formation of an orogenic wedge here with the formation of naps. The formation of the internal structures of the orogenic wedge are governed both by shear-eating and structural softening. So this brings me to my last slide. So what's next? We are developing right now models to study the effect of viscous anisotropy on strain localization. Here you see 3 different strain maps from 3 different models. The left model is a linear viscous model with an isotropic rheological viscosity. The middle one has a constant anisotropy, and the left one has an evolving anisotropy. Both models with anisotropy present non-trivial shear localization patterns, especially outside of the shear zone. Another topic we are currently working on is the effect of reaction softening. Here, for example, we design a model which shows the transition from granulite to eclogite in the matrix. You see a stress perturbator is the circular inclusion. With ongoing deformation, pressure builds up next to this stress perturbator, and you see now a green zone. This is a zone where granulite has stress formed to eclogite, so the viscosity changes as a function of the pressure here. As this zone is growing, we have interaction with frictional deformation in the granulite, and with ongoing deformation, the ductile deformation, viscous deformation, and transformation of granulite to eclogite overprints brittle deformation. So this is another interesting aspect of interaction between different shear localization mechanisms. Now the take-home messages. So plate tectonics require the propagation of shear zones across strong plates. So 2D is strongly recommended to study this kind of shear localization. Stresses are transient. They vary significantly in space and time. At this point, we don't know whether there is a dominant localization mechanism. These mechanisms can be concurrent, competing, or collaborative. We need to be able to model them simultaneously to understand how they interact. There is also an increasing agreement between theory, models, experiments, and observation, but we need efforts from all members of the community to move forward. Thanks a lot for your attention.